Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Kanik. Colleagues, as of 1st February, I'm the Regional Director for Asia Pacific and no longer Climate Director. You've also heard about loss of nature, land degradation, pollution, and the impact on water. If we start to look at the three crises, what we're calling the triple planetary crises, and it relates to its impact on water, whether it's disasters, floods, droughts, desertifications, we're looking at wildfire, and it's all linked to water. My presentation today will really focus on three aspects. I'll talk about glacial lakes, I'll talk about decarbonization, and I'll talk about air pollution. And I think it's really good that we frame it from a South Asia perspective. The Himalayas, as Kanak's talked about the third pole, talks about home to vast glaciers that feed major river systems, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra. And yet we know that the rising temperatures, the glacial melt, the erratic weather patterns threatens livelihoods. This year, 2025, is International Year of Glaciers, and it's really an opportunity for us to highlight the adverse impacts of climate change. You've already heard how the impacts of glacial melt, but what you've seen is that the glacial melt has increased from 1998 to 2007, and it will further increase till 2050. And the far-reaching impacts of agricultural impact, you're looking at food security, livelihoods of millions depend on farming, the economic strain, again, the damage to infrastructure. We've seen when we've had basically monsoon floods on steroids, devastating impacts. You've looked at the health impacts, waterborne diseases, compromising water and sanitation, public health challenges, and of course, energy security. A lot of the region depends upon hydropower. But what we're not seeing, and there are many interventions, there's the early warning for all, there's the systematic observation financing facility, and a lot of this is looking at data, sharing of data, but I think in South Asia we can do better. For us, we can learn from each other in terms of the data that we share, in terms of the hydrological, meteorological information, climate resilient policies, investing in water management, learning from floods, glacial lake outburst floods, how do we restore ecosystems. And this is probably the sub-region where there is the lowest level of exchange of information, and here there is an opportunity to do so. But while we look at, when we look at the adaptation to the adverse impacts of climate change, the flip side is we need to reduce carbon emissions to slow glacial retreat. And so while we look at building adaptive capacity, building resilience, everyone talks about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we had the 29th Conference of Parties. And really, what are they? I mean, the focus is the focus on mitigation, and if you look at the nationally determined contributions, it's basically for every country to look at an investment plan. In order to address climate mitigation, this is a country's investment plan. These are the greenhouse gas sources and sinks. These are the sectors that will be impacted. And on the flip side, countries produce national adaptation plans. And these are plans that are supposed to really look at how does a country formulate plans to reduce vulnerability? How do you integrate climate into planning budgetary systems? How do you look at agricultural resilience, food security? But often what has happened is that how we work on climate change, and we have tremendous negotiators. We have, minister, we have, the coordinator minister from Pakistan. We have their voices, which are really important, because it's going to need a signal to the financial system, to the architecture, on where resources are, the signal for trade and environment. And And the third part about this process is what we call the transparency regime. And it's a regime where we measure, report, verify the information and the resources for countries to look at building the information base that helps them understand the impacts, both mitigation and adaptation. So many countries in our region have prepared national adaptation plans. Pakistan is preparing one, Nepal has, Mongolia has, Maldives have. And all these plans, they've identified agriculture, food security, health and well-being, infrastructure, energy systems, early warning, disaster reduction as the top sectors. And there's been a lot of efforts to include water, freshwater ecosystems. But where we find, and all these processes, I mean, if I've started to look at countries that have been successful, it's been successful when you've had a presidential council or a prime minister's council that looks at climate. Because climate, unlike many other issues, it affects energy, it affects infrastructure, it affects transport, it affects water, it affects health, it affects food systems, it affects agriculture. So you can't depend on your traditional sectoral ministers. It affects trade and environment. It has to come together. And I'm very excited that under the leadership of our UN Western Coordinator, Mohammed, is actually going to do, an analytic work on the financial flows that come in. When we looked at the 100 billion that went to climate finance, and now you're looking at a new target, many countries wanted to know where that money was coming. And we found that much of it that came in was not understood by the country, the governments, and a lot of it was going through private sector. And I think the more information that is out there, that would be important to understand where the interventions are happening. In India, if you look, you had the National Agricultural Bank of Rural Development, NABARD, 50 billion, and they realized all the interventions for agricultural interventions, and they're now accredited to the Green Climate Fund. So much of the work that is happening, I think, there isn't enough information, and I think there's an opportunity to put this information to see where there are transitions happening. If you look at emissions, decarbonization, 80% of the emissions are from the G20 countries. So that's already there. So already the focus is, which countries we have to focus on. In this region, the emissions, 55% of Asia-Pacific accounts for all the global emissions, comes from urbanization, industrialization, deforestation, fossil fuel. And if we look at the energy increase, our region, the energy increase grew 151% between 2000 to 2023. So every year countries, the next round of nationally determined contributions they expect it to be ready by February 2025, and many countries will take longer. And what the NDCs give us an understanding and accounting of where we are in the emission gap. And this is the emission gap to stay within 1.5 degrees. Right now, in order to stay within a 1.5 degree world, a very, very small gap, I mean, we have to cut emissions 42% by 2030, 57% by 2035. And so the emissions from our region, again, you've heard this morning, energy, industry, transport, waste, forestry, agriculture, marine ecosystems. And South Asia continues to have an appetite for coal. While we see coal and the use of coal in energy production declining, it still represented 60% of energy generation in South Asia in 2021. And so when we look at how do we hasten this transition, many countries in Southeast Asia, in Africa, have signed up to the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And the Just Energy Transition Partnership is getting financing to hasten the investment in renewables. So we start to look at, our region, the instruments they use are subsidies, tax, incentives, tariffs, and And there are positive stories. I mean, India now has a target, a renewable energy capacity target of 450 gigawatts by 2030, a national hydrogen mission. And we've started to look at, when South Korea had their Green New Deal, they invested 61 billion renewable energy, green grids, smart grids, energy efficiency, the Just Energy Transition Partnership in our region, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka's aim to achieve 70% renewable energy generation by 2030, phasing out coal by 2042, and a very ambitious EV policy. Bhutan's committed to carbon neutrality, and here again, it's linked to maintaining forest cover at 60%. And so while we know that where countries have been successful are if there is the policy and then the instruments that follow, and there can be a lot of cross-country learning in South Asia. At the UN, we set up what we call an issue-based coalition, and it's about 17 UN agencies at the regional level. And our focus is to look at the nationally determined contributions. These are investment plans countries do, and try to learn from each other. We've also looked at sharing practices in low energy, and we've looked at showcasing emission gaps. Every year, the issue-based coalition produces sort of a nationally determined contribution from the Asia-Pacific region. And this information, we are hoping countries will come together and then look at different ways that they can work together. The South Asia Cooperative Environment Program, based in Sri Lanka, and they have on their governing council all the ministers of South Asia. They've had the Mali Declaration to combat transboundary movement of air pollution, and they've produced science policy assessments. ICIMOD has done a lot of work on glacial lake outburst floods, and they have their regional science policy frameworks, adaptation at altitude. They're working on air pollution, they're working on glacial melt, and they've also been starting to look at discussing, would there be space for something like a Hindu Kush Council? If the glaciers and the mountains are so important for the region, we have the Arctic Council. Is there a space where South Asia can sit together and discuss some of these issues? Does it matter what the mountainous countries do and its impact on the low-lying countries? And an SCAP hosted in last December, a workshop on air pollution and looking at policies and technical cooperation. Kanak's already talked quite a bit about air pollution, and he's talked about the importance of limiting the melting of the water towers and the interlinkages between air quality and climate change. And when we talked about air pollution, we really look at black carbon, short-lived climate pollutants, and they pose a dual threat. It harms health, glacial melt. And so, Kanak's already talked about if there's additional warming due to black carbon and dust deposited on glaciers and snowfields in the Hindu Kush Karakoram Himalayas, and it leads to accelerated melting. So at the moment, I mean, when we worry about, melting glaciers, we worry about not having enough snow, we worry about our rivers not being replenished. We don't want another force that accelerates melting of glaciers. And so, in addition to carbon dioxide, we have to start to look at short-lived climate pollutants. We have to look at gases like methane and nitrous oxide. And if you look at methane, addressing methane emissions would be 0.3% centigrade of global warming by 2045. And you're talking about losing less 25 million tons of crop losses and less 260,000 premature deaths. The International Methane Emission Observatory has what you call a methane alert response system, and they have these satellites on the ground, and they provide actionable data. And last year, UNEP issued 1,200 notifications of major methane leaks, and 2 of those leaks led to the equivalent, shutting off the leaks led to the equivalent of 1 million cars the emissions from 1 million cars produced annually being turned off. So while you're looking at other ways to reduce emissions, there are technological in terms of shutting off the methane leaks. And again, nitrous oxide, again, premature deaths. And so here it's really important that we start to look at their impact. The burden of air pollution on South Asia, we were looking at WHO interim target of 35 micrograms is considered the least stringent, and you start to see the particulate matter across the region. You've seen numbers. So we're looking at acting on air quality, benefits from climate, air quality point of view. Under the SCAP, there's a regional action program on air pollution, a resolution. And what this means is the region would come together. We would monitor air pollution. We would do source apportionment, so we would know which sectors had the major emissions. And then we would look at mitigation measures. UNEP is also looking at a regional instrument for air pollution. So I think my message is whether we look at air pollution, we look at glacial lake outburst floods, we look at decarbonization, this is tremendous opportunity for this sub-region. Thank you, Kanak.